Given all the current uncertainty, how should organizations think through their scenarios?
A few things I like to keep in mind is I always start with defining the scenarios that we're about to consider. So I keep in mind that the goal is to gain a better understanding of our financial position over the long term, and I try not to get bogged down in the details while doing it. There's also a lot of moving pieces in any given business, so I try to limit the number of moving pieces as I go through this. If I can't reasonably differentiate a certain business driver from one scenario to the next, I don't even try. As you get more comfortable with the process, you can start to expand as you will get more comfortable over time. But to start, focus on the main drivers that will move the needle at the institution. I also think it's good to include many different voices in this process when you're defining the scenarios and the various impacts. Not only will you generate some unique ideas, but it'll also help with consensus once you decide on the path forward. For each scenario, you want to consider the main drivers and how they are impacted by the conditions you're setting and understand the range of possibilities. So for each scenario, you want to be complete, but also realistic. So one of the things to avoid is just describing a scenario as best case. What does best case means? A lot of times I see people talk about, well, best case for revenue is high growth. Best case for my expense drivers is low growth. And when you take that in totality, it's sometimes an unrealistic outcome. If it is realistic, that's great. That's a great thing to consider. But more often than not, you're going to have to spend money in order to achieve that best case scenario outcome. And so you just want to make sure that you're setting realistic assumptions so that the scenarios and the results that you see are possible. Once you do that, you also want to evaluate initiatives. So what are the strategic items that are under consideration and which ones do you want to see if you can afford to do or not? And you also want to consider if there's any corrective action that you might need to take. So if there's a strategic item that you want to do but maybe can't afford yet, are there measures you can take that will help you afford it? Once you make a decision, you'll also want to put in place a monitoring system to ensure you achieve success with your plan. 3 months from now, you'll likely know more about COVID than you do today, or whatever scenario it is. And so you want to put something in place that allows you to evaluate if any assumptions need to be updated and what the ultimate outcome is going to be.
How many scenarios should you create?
The best place to start is 4. So this 2x2 matrix is helpful to consider. So what's going on here is if we take the COVID example, how long is it going to impact our business? Is it going to be short impact from here on out or a long impact from here on out? And how kind of deeply is it going to affect our business? So is it going to be easy and short or easy and long? Or are they going to be deep impacts, so hard impacts for a short period of time or hard impacts for a long period of time? So this visual lets you kind of strongly differentiate the scenarios that you're considering, but keep realistic. So the 4 we'll talk about today are baseline and scenarios 1 through 3. On this slide, what I've done is I've chosen 2 metrics that I use to help make decisions, so operating margin and my cash balance. And we're currently looking at the baseline scenario. So this is the scenario where we have 22 impact is moderately impacted, but a return to normal in 23. And I've already gone through and set all of the drivers for my business. And so we can see in 22, we're better than what we've been, but still decreased from historical standards. But in 23 and beyond, we're basically back to normal. What I'm considering for all of these scenarios are 2 strategic objectives. So there's 2 initiatives that we're considering that we really want to do, and we're just trying to figure out if we can afford them. And I've also created some responses that I might need to take given the impacts of COVID. And finally, I have some backlog projects. So these aren't necessarily strategic projects, but they're still projects that we'd like to do someday. And finally, a shock test where I can shock the system if I need to. So starting out under my baseline conditions, what I'm trying to figure out is, can I afford to do my 2 most important strategic projects? And here, looking at the operating margin, I can see that in 22, I go negative. And I might decide I don't want to do that. I need to keep a positive margin no matter what we do. So I will turn off the capital project and really decide I can only do one of the two strategic initiatives within 22. For my next scenario, scenario 1, this is our most optimistic case. This is minimal impact on 22. Here, maybe I can do both. If I go in, turn both on, I can see yes, as long as I'm okay with the slight dip in the margin, it's still positive, I'd be able to move forward. Scenario 2, this is the large impact in 22, but then return to normal in 23. And I can see before I even consider my strategic initiatives, I have a deficit that I'd like to address. So here's where the responses come into play. And given 2022, there's a large impact of COVID, I doubt I'll be traveling a lot, or anybody on the team will be traveling a lot. So I can reduce my travel budget. And I might have to also reduce salaries. That puts me in positive territory again. And if you wanted to, you could consider, okay, we may not be able to afford the strategic investments that we want to make, but maybe one of those backlog projects we'd be able to afford given all the changes we're expecting. Then finally, scenario 3, which is our most pessimistic case, is a large impact in 22 and a slow return to normal. And so here, really, I'm just on defense, trying to figure out how can I solve for the deficits that I'm seeing. And so these are extended travel reductions, extended salary reductions. And if you have any other revenue producing projects or anything like that, that would obviously need to be considered given this scenario.
How can we use this to inform decision making?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of moving pieces, and yeah, in some scenarios you can afford it, some you can't. So this is more about going through the process that will give you the confidence you need in order to feel more confident in that decision, and then having that monitoring program in place to ensure you execute properly. So as an example, going through this analysis, we saw that for one of our strategic initiatives, the academic program, we could afford it in 2 of the 4 scenarios we evaluated. But also going through this, we've created options that will either generate new revenue or cut expenses that we have as a backup plan in case either of the other 2 conservative scenarios play out. And it's a similar story for capital. If we do both of these, and leadership might want to, the question may not be, can we afford it? It might be, how can we afford it? You already have a list of responses that you can put in place to start to address some of the shortfalls that you're seeing to help pay for these strategically important initiatives. And armed with all of this information, you feel confident that you'll be able to navigate the institution through any scenario that occurs. But also the key final step is to put a process to monitor this moving forward.
What does a monitoring system look like?
So the typical cadence we see here is quarterly. So every 3 months, look back, evaluate how you did, and start the process all over again. Are there any new scenarios you need to consider? Do assumptions need to change? Are there new initiatives on the table? So on and so forth. And if you do this quarterly, you'll help stack the odds in your favor that you'll be successful in the long run.